Hi, this is Kirby Sommers
And this is Jeremy ROTHE-KUSHEL'S.
for the Epstein Project podcast.
Today, we are going to be moving around on a fairly wide range of issues, but really hone in on a few revelations and characters in the recent days of the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. And we're going to be dealing with Ghislaine Maxwell in the courtroom, certain witnesses, such as the notorious Epstein pilot, Larry Visoski, the housekeeper, Juan Alessi. Additionally, the household manual for the Epstein-Maxwell household operation. We are going to be delving into that and then get into a few more macro level points of analysis today. So forgive us if we bounce around a lot, please.
We are going to be bouncing around. So the first thing that I noticed that I thought was very strange, Jeremy, is that Ghislaine Maxwell was allowed to hug her family. So Isabel Maxwell was in the courtroom, and her other brother, Kevin Maxwell, not Ian, he's still in England giving interviews to anyone who'll listen about how wonderful Ghislaine is. But her brother, Kevin Maxwell, appeared in the courtroom. And Ghislaine is not just hugging, and it's very odd, number one, because of the COVID problem that we currently have. So she's been hugging her attorneys, and nobody has said anything. And I always thought, well, I thought you're really not supposed to touch anyone if you're a prisoner. But when I found out that she hugged her sister and her brother, I'm thinking, wait a minute, you're not allowed to touch. What's going on with that, do you think?
I'm out of it, and that this is allowed a lot, but I've never been familiar with a defendant in a criminal case being able to hug their family in the middle of the case in the courtroom. But maybe I've just missed things. And I guess, all we've seen are these drawings and all of that. But it is very interesting that people notice this, and that it was been picked up. It was picked up in the drawings. And I noticed in most of these drawings, too, of Maxwell, she's wearing her mask, but it's almost always sort of slips down under her nose.
Yeah, so she's
once
wearing
again,
it improperly.
inconsiderate at the very least.
Well, speaking about the drawings, there had been in, let's say, when somebody like Daphne Barak for the Daily Mail writes a story about Ghislaine Maxwell, we can expect it to be to have some factual errors. And so at this point, I think we know that a lot of her friends are in mainstream media writing these stories. And so I almost believed that, oh, when the person is on the witness stand, she is taking notes. Well, I happen to know she can't write very well because I wrote her biography, and I know that she has a little problem, and I have a handwritten note that belongs to her, and I know she can't write and spell. So I thought that's really interesting. She's writing. What could she possibly be writing? Except that I happen to have caught all of the sketches that this wonderful artist has drawn of her. And what Colette Maxwell has been doing, and forgive me if I start laughing, but she has been drawing the people who have been testifying against her. Now, if that isn't the most frightening thought, that to have Ghislaine Maxwell staring you down and draw you as you speak to I just found that to be very villainous, keeping with her character.
Totally, because the way that a usual defendant would be working, if they were doing anything at their defense table, they would be taking specific notes. Even if she has a hard time handwriting, she would be making informational notes to be able to help aid her defense attorneys in making her case the strongest that it is, and remembering certain points that certain people testifying, witnesses have brought up, in order to then remind her attorneys that that's not the case, or we can attack them there. But instead, she's just staring at them, drawing their face. It feels like a threat of some sort.
That's how it came across to me. In fact, her brother, Kevin, when Jane Doe was on the stand, who's the first victim of four, to describe what happened to her, leaned forward in his seat, took off his glasses, put them back on, kept repeating this gesture. And it did come across very threatening. Here you have a woman who's terrified. She's sitting up there telling the world of the most horrific moments of her life. And in her case, it was 3 years of this. Um, and Ghislaine Maxwell's brother is leaning forward in a seat, taking on and taking off, and she's drawing the woman. That's very intimidating. The fact that this woman, I mean, she did break down and cry at one point, but intimidation. And I kind of always thought that it was the judge's responsibility with because there's also what are they called? They're like they stand around in the courtroom.
The
Um,
bailiffs.
yes, that they keep the sitting public uh sort of like in order, right?
Yeah.
And that if you're misbehaving, they take you out of the room. That's not happening here. Nobody's being admonished for bad behavior.
Wow. See, that's interesting. Like when I had my little municipal case in Kansas City after being arrested while questioning a former diplomat to Israel, Dennis Ross, in our first appearance in the courtroom, just for checking my phone for looking for certain notes while we were sitting in the back, the bailiff at some point almost threatened to have me get out of the room. So it's very interesting that at this level that the bailiffs are not apparently enforcing the severe order of this trial.
Yes, and this is a very important trial. And so it's if it's not being handled properly at that level, I don't really put a lot of my trust in Judith Nathan. What is her name? Allison Nathan. Allison Judith Nathan, right? So I don't put a lot of trust in her anymore. Not that I had any, but so the other thing was because we did speak about what Ghislaine Maxwell wore to court the first day, which I thought was interesting. But this pilot, Larry Visoski, who had been Leslie Wexner's pilot and began working for Jeffrey Epstein in 1990, pictures were taken of him walking into the courtroom. Well, I was a fashion designer and I zeroed in on those monogram slippers with his initials on them, and the fact that the suit that he's wearing to court is a custom made suit. There's a certain way that that kind of suit falls on the body. So the only number one, the only other pilot that I know of that would have the kind of money to afford a custom made suit and to walk around with monogram slippers, just like Jeffrey Epstein did, would be somebody like Barry Seal, who was, bringing in cocaine for the CIA. And then, maybe that he got $1 million every now and then, but not someone who's just a pilot for you. And so I thought that was odd. I'm going to just ask you if you think that a pilot how much do you think like a custom made suit costs, Jeremy? You're a guy.
I mean, I've never had a custom made
There you
suit,
go.
so I imagine there are thousands of dollars with the
Yeah.
combination of the tailoring and the materials and all of that. And like you're saying that, the average person, let's say the average person who has a private plane or who has access to a private plane is not either enforcing or like encouraging it's basically it's a mobby kind of aura, fashion aura that you see going on here with the names on these sort of velvet slippers or svelte slippers and the suit and all that. And then when you combine that with what's been revealed about Visoski, reminder too, Epstein got Visoski as his pilot from Leslie Wexner, right?
Right. Yep.
Originally. And but
Yep.
all then the relationship with just directly with Epstein and Visoski is not like your average contracting pilot, professional pilot kind of relationship. He's giving him 40 acres.
Right.
He's helping. He gives him a place for I believe the wedding for his daughter. And so this is something that's much more in the relation. It's something like a relationship related to what you might call a mob, or in a Yiddish term that was hijacked by the mob, by the Jewish mob, it would be called mishpucha, which means family. So it's not really like a friendship family per se. It's not blood relatives. It's not really an adopted son or brother or uncle. It's actually, you are now in the Omerta-based syndicate, which then Visoski then backs up in his own testimony on the stand after naming a bunch of high-profile names that I have to then immediately retract from our last recording, that while I was asserting that it was very likely that none of these names would even be mentioned, Visoski was probably at that moment on the stand naming those names.
He was.
Yeah. So I retract that, my suspicion that these names wouldn't even be brought up. But now what's very interesting is that he brings up all the big names. He brings up the Bill Clinton. He brings up the Prince Andrew. He brings up the Donald Trump on the plane. But meanwhile, he says, I didn't see any underage girls, and he mentioned he saw nothing wrong, is what it sounds like to me, in terms of the direct through line of his testimony.
Yeah, no, he said he never saw anything, and he thought that Jane, who had just turned 14, because her birthday is in August, and so that's kind of when they ensnared her into this horrific life. He says, oh, well, she was well developed, and to me, she was a woman, and she had piercing blue eyes. So number one, if he's not following the manual, Jeremy, because we're gonna have to go to the manual, but he's not following the manual. He's not like trying to keep it all professional. It doesn't sound like to me. So I think you have a good point that he was part of the family. I mean, he did come from Wexner with the plane. Him and the 747 were transferred over to Jeffrey Epstein. So, and then he gives him all of that property in New Mexico when he has a nice big wedding for his daughter. The one thing that I don't see anyone mentioning, which I forgot to bring up, is that Bill Clinton and Hillary would spend time in Jeffrey Epstein's New Mexico ranch. The only other person on the property at the time would, of course, just be the housekeepers for the mansion. But there's like a separate house that was used by Clinton and Hillary, but it would be Larry Visoski, who was there also when Clinton was there. So he's definitely an in guy. We have the manual. So
Yeah.
Jeremy, you want to tell them? And then I think we should just say something about the manual, because this is a variant. Now I know how to do my carpets perfectly well because of this manual. Thank you, Ghislaine.
Teaching me that you need to comb the edges of your carpets.
Yes, you have to comb the edges of the carpet with a comb. But we found some really interesting things. And so one of them, and then Jeremy's going to take over at this point, is you have to be unobtrusive. So unobtrusive,
yes,
is key. You have to remember, you see nothing, you hear nothing, you say nothing except to answer a question directed at you. Respect their privacy. But Jeremy, you had a really interesting point that while Larry Visoski is on the stand dropping all of these names, he is at the same time saying, I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. I am not saying anything. And you picked up that he's doing what?
He's not. He's following the house rules to a large extent here, and this is the household manual that has been released. It's Government Exhibit 606 for the house at 358 El Brillo Way in Palm Beach, Florida, 33480. And there's a whole long list of contents, grooming and guest relations. And it is interesting. I noticed that they say grooming and then guest relations. So they don't talk about personal appearance, but they use the language of grooming, which of course, that's how you can work on your physical appearance and you present yourself in a certain way. And so there's actually a resonance there in terms of what I think you picked up on in terms of Visoski's slippers and his suit and all of that, that there's a uniform here in relationship to appearance that suggests something way beyond just a professional appearance, but it actually has to do with much deeper rules of the quote unquote family that you've been brought into in many ways.
I don't think, Jeremy, that when Visoski was working for Epstein, he was allowed to dress in this manner because it is also the code of the Cosa Nostra that you don't, unless you're Hoffa, or I mean, you're less what's that guy, the Dapper Don, I forget his name, that you don't, because that's one of the reasons that Jeffrey Epstein dressed down. He was always in sweats. So Larry Visoski wasn't out dressing Epstein at that time. I think that once he stopped working for him, he then thought it was safe to show his flash. And he forgets that when you show your flash and you show that you can wear custom made suits that cost perhaps $10,000 for that suit that he wore to court the other day, and perhaps $2,000 pair of shoes that are moccasins, made just for him, by the way, that he blew it. However, when he was on the stand dropping all of those names, Jeremy, you said it very astutely, and I think because we have so much we want to cover, I'm going to remind you that you're the one who said he is threatening the people that I just dropped your names, but I am basically saying that I saw nothing, right? Don't you think? So that's what you told me,
Yes.
and I agree with you 100% that he's threatening them.
Yes, and I want to draw out just a little bit about the Visoski testimony. What I noticed, and definitely the key piece of it is exactly what you are reminding me of here, which is directly from the household manual. Quote: remember that you see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, except to answer a question directed at you. Respect their privacy, unquote, is one major point. After unobtrusive is the key in their household manual from the Florida property. Okay, so Visoski, I also want to point out how inappropriate it is the way that he actually talked about victim Jane, in terms of the way that he appeared to be, in my eyes, doing the thing of saying, well, I couldn't, she looked older than I thought she was. And he talked about the size of her breasts, I
Yes.
believe.
Yes.
And, I mean, I was in high school. When I was a new kid in high school, there was a girl and we were interested in each other. I knew she was 15. She had big breasts, but I knew she was 15. And so then for a grown man who was there for all of this to then comment on that on the stand, to me, is almost seems to be at the same time trying to run cover for the grown men that were on these flights, while also potentially re-traumatizing and re-sexualizing a wound in public at some level. And you got to know that the victims are this whole thing is very traumatic. It's hard enough to engage in the legal process whether it's the investigative part of the process where you're in a room and people are potentially grilling you. Maybe they're not actually trying to make you stumble, as the then opposition lawyers will eventually do when you're in public testimony. But all of that, of discussing things that are personal, that are private, details that one would never discuss with what are strangers. And then when you go a layer beyond that, where you're dealing then with sexual crimes and trauma, and especially in relationship to have being still a child, that there's a lot to the ongoing I think, push in the public aspect of this trial to re-traumatize both the victims and, at some level, the public in relationship to it. So I did notice that in relationship to Visoski's testimony. Then, in terms of the naming of these names, these big names that I thought would be largely avoided in relationship, at least in terms of the prosecution. It's interesting that Visoski names the names and then goes directly to the family manual of, but I saw nothing, I heard nothing, and I'm saying nothing, except for the basic level that he has to admit the truth, rather than being openly in violation of perjury laws, is what it looks like to me. But at the same time, there's an implication here. And this is the way the Omerta code actually works, right? In terms of like whatever level of like organized crime, whether it's a local gang on up to the transnational, deep mob syndicate that surrounds this entire Epstein Maxwell operation alongside the espionage part of it, that there's a thing where you do crimes together, whether it's sort of like, getting jumping somebody together if you're getting initiated into the local street gang, or doing a property crime together, or on up to the question of doing murder together, and that then becomes the blood seal for that level of the family, and in this case, potentially this mishpucha aspect of this specific mob operation. And so there's some kind of implication in relationship to naming these level of names, while then saying, but remember, I saw nothing, I heard nothing, and I'm saying nothing. But the implication is there, while that person is, in this case, Visoski, is refulfilling his household duty in the household manual, while he's testifying in probably the biggest criminal case of the century, very likely. He's also, or someone through him potentially, is also reminding the entirety of this network at the top levels, in terms of these former presidents at this point, this prince, that they are implicated. And that although Visoski at this time is saying, I saw nothing, I hear nothing, I say nothing, they know what they did. They know the criminality that they did in quote unquote private. And so there's sort of an openly veiled threat to the question of don't make me go there, I think is what's implied by it.
Yes, and there's another aspect of this. So Larry Visoski was his pilot. Alan Dershowitz was his attorney. It's my understanding, having spoken to many of the victims, that some of the staff, like Alan Dershowitz, who was staff, he was just his attorney, and yeah, he had him come over to a couple of parties and things like that. But as you know, Virginia Giuffre has alleged, as has another woman, that Alan Dershowitz, she was made to please him a half a dozen times, if not more. And one of those times was on the plane. So that it is my kind of feeling, like, number one, I don't believe Visoski at all. And with his nothing happened, I didn't see anything. He actually said in order to let's say if he needed to take a break and go to the restroom, that he would have to walk through the entirety of the plane. The plane had beds on it. The plane had it was the victims have basically said we were abused also, in his planes, in his cars, in his homes, not just on the island. It didn't just, so I believe that Larry Visoski was given the same kind of privilege that was extended to Alan Dershowitz, that was extended to perhaps some of the other household help, in order to do exactly what you said, to make him part of the family. Because if we murder together, using your thing, although I do believe that some people were murdered, that if you commit a crime together, you're not going to give each other up.
Exactly. And I think that is what is being implied here, is that you are dealing now in full public view, now that someone like Visoski's on the stand, with some aspect of high level organized crime. And in this case, as you keep pointing out, this is not just high level organized crime, maybe the highest levels of organized crime, but it also intersects with things like national security and espionage and blackmail at the scale of transnational blackmail. And maybe even as we begin, to unpack some of the bigger technology aspects surrounding this family, this Maxwell crime family, that this is potentially on the scale of even civilizational compromise and a civilizational organized crime, in terms of the undermining and the backdooring of all of our technology, and how this family appears to be at the very least, part and parcel of something that's operating even above their head.
Yes. For him to have made this very bold-faced statement, which is a lie, indicates that he has been told by the intelligence agencies, and in this case, I'm going to just name them: the CIA, the Mossad, and MI5. But because we're in the United States, by the CIA, who I very much believe is part of this whole thing. And in fact, there have been other cases that are an extension of this, in my opinion. I don't believe this is the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell trafficking ring. I think this is just a little piece of a much bigger ongoing series of trafficking cases that involve children. So I think that for him to have perjured himself, because that's what I believe, he was given the okay, you need to perjure yourself. And the only people that are allowed to perjure themselves are people who work for the government. If you're an FBI informant, you're going to perjure yourself because you've been given permission. If you work for the CIA, you can lie. No one's going to call you on it. And while initially, when people had me on their shows and they would ask me, what do you think is going to happen with the Ghislaine Maxwell case? I just instinctively said, possibly we're going to have closed door proceedings, because this is very much like Iran-Contra. They're not going to be able to talk about X, Y, and Z. So, but they've done the next best thing, right? So I don't have it in front of me, but I know that on November 1st or November 2nd, the law changed, because we had been able to listen in. This is still a federal case. Federal cases are not televised, but we were all able to listen in from the time that Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested, her first day in court, which happened on June 14, 2020. I called in, I heard the whole thing. I've called in for all of the appearances, and the same number and the same code. I decided, well, I'm going to call it in. And then it wasn't working. And I'm like, why is it not working? And I discovered the law changed. Well, isn't that a very handy thing? And then, isn't that an extension possibly of what the blackmail allows you to do? It allows you to put someone in office, Antony Blinken as an example. In my opinion, I'm allowed to have opinions. and
Mhm.
and change the law, because we're going to start this case, and while we can't overtly close the door to the public, guess what? We're going to close the door to the public in another way.
That's very interesting. And I also, called into at least a couple of those pretrial conferences on that line. And it was, although there was limits to how many people could get on there, it was basically a virtual overflow room in relationship to being able to show up at trial, and especially in relationship to, as you've pointed out, during a COVID era, it made tons of sense to expand the digital access to the public to these things. And apparently, it is the case that other judges within Southern District New York have allowed live audio feeds. The apparently the federal DC district is also often allows
Yes.
live feeds. The Supreme Court, for example, which does not allow video, does also have live audio feeds. And now I understand there's an aspect of the potential protection of certain aspects at the very least in terms of victim privacy and certain types of evidence, that I totally understand the question of live cameras, and then also how it can then influence the trial. But in terms of if there are these overflow rooms, if the press is allowed to go in and take notes, for example, of the
Mm-hmm.
trial as it's going on, then the general public should also have direct access to a live audio feed, so then we can then assess the information. And if even if we're not allowed to assess the facial features and the more, thinking about intelligence in terms of human intelligence of how we assess each other is very physical very often when we're in person and stuff like that. And so, of course, we wouldn't have all of that if we don't have live video feeds, but just inflection in voice, pauses, the way that someone like Visoski sounds when he says these things. I know that in the past, I've been able to unpack those kinds of pieces of human information to draw out all kinds of surrounding information about just the direct content that's supplied in a transcript. So I concur with you, Kirby, that I think
Mm-hmm.
that there's something wrong here in terms of the lack of direct access for the public to this trial ongoing.
Yeah, it happened 1 month before the trial commenced, and that to me seems very shady. But I want to bring everyone's attention to the fact that one of the Palm Beach police officers who went into Jeffrey Epstein's home in 2005, when
Michael Dawson.
yeah, Michael Dawson. So he got on the stand at around 4-ish in the afternoon on Friday. And basically, he uh, searched Epstein's residence. The massage table was at this point introduced into the courtroom, um, found the sex toys, found correspondence and other materials. Um, it was Dawson who, in court, introduced a photograph of Epstein's sex toys into evidence, and the brand name of the sex toys were the twin torpedoes. Um, and then right after that, Judge Nathan basically said, "We're done for the night." So afterwards, a motion was filed Friday night. A motion was filed. Jeremy, did I send you the motion? It's
You
dated
sent me the,
December.
you sent me the motion, Kirby, and it is titled "Regarding United States v. Ghislaine Maxwell." And it says, "Dear Judge Nathan, the parties have reached an agreement in principle to a testimonial stipulation regarding the anticipated testimony of Michael Dawson. Accordingly, the parties jointly and respectfully request that the court release Michael Dawson from his obligation to return to court on Monday."
So don't you? I mean, I was just stunned when I saw that, because he had just started. Nathan is like, "We're done," right after the twin torpedoes are introduced to court. And by the way, this is information that was released only because Virginia Giuffre also. That's why we're familiar with that term because this was released during the Virginia Giuffre versus Ghislaine Maxwell defamation lawsuit. And what the public was able, at least those of us who pay a lot of attention to this case, is that one of the things that Ghislaine Maxwell was fighting desperately for was for this specific information, this box of sex toys be not permitted to be disclosed to the public. But he did. Dawson introduces a photograph of the sex toys before this testimony. Alessi had discussed that the box, there was a box, and whether it's this box, I'm not 100% sure, but it could be this box because it has almost the same name as the one that Ghislaine was trying to hide, that it was in Ghislaine Maxwell's closet, that it belonged to her. But Judge Nathan is like, we're done for the night. All right, it's going to be 5 o'clock. I understand. But for then both the prosecution and the defense to say, oh, we don't need Michael Dawson, we're in agreement, he doesn't have to come back to court. That to me, it smells dirty.
It does smell dirty, especially since he obviously has direct testimonial evidence, which very often the entirety of the legal system is almost at its core based on testimony of witnesses. And so even beyond objects or video, and video can do a lot, obviously, because it helps establish the objective record. But ultimately, you have to have witnesses who, at the very least, can then testify that the evidence itself of the video evidence has not been tampered with, that this is what I saw at that time. Also, so that this direct witness of the actual layout in terms of the objects and the surroundings and the context of the sex crimes is then shut down fairly quickly and then released from further testifying is very damning. And of course, there was Judge Nathan in the run up to the trial had said she wanted to limit the exposure of what was being called maybe salacious details and that kind of thing. But in this case, those quote unquote salacious details are crucial to establishing the basic facts of the crimes that are being alleged. So when you then interrupt and then dismiss a very likely potentially key witness at the very least to the crimes that are being alleged, and then additionally what you point out, that a large important piece of the legal process, whether criminal in this case or civil in Virginia's previous case, where we got tons of information that had never been seen before. And as we're continuing to get more information that hasn't been seen before, that you basically rob not only the victims of some of their strongest evidence being established, but you also then rob the public of our capacity to have a knowledge of more evidence that very likely would have some kind of public interest to us.
100%. So, they're cutting this off in areas that are very disturbing. And I don't know that people are going to pick up the fact that both the prosecution and the defense are said, okay, we don't need him. Now, I looked at his LinkedIn page, which is gone. It's amazing how quickly these online portals are disappearing. Maybe I'll find it again. I don't know, but I looked at it this morning, and at some point he was with the FBI, and then he went into the Palm Beach Police Department, and I had this whole thing that I copied from his LinkedIn page. Well, it seemed a little backwards to me. However, his testimony was coming across as the first honest testimony, right? Like, okay, this is stuff that we got when we raided Jeffrey Epstein's Palm Beach house. We've not seen that with the New York property because Epstein died conveniently. We're only being able to get a glimpse of that through this trial. And for Judge Nathan, honestly, if I were Judge Nathan, I would have kept the guy talking, and then, at least for another half hour. What's, there's some judges who let it go past 5 o'clock, but then if Judge Nathan agrees not to let this guy come back, she gets another bad mark from me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because even in my, little municipal trial related to the Kansas City Public Library arrest case, it's in the same courtroom there where people are dealing with, traffic violations, potential, parking tickets that built up. The judge in that case allowed our case. In that case, it was actually of the librarian who'd been arrested alongside me, for his trial to run past hours until it was all the witnesses had been well heard.
Wow.
There had been cross-examination, and the entirety of the trial had run. So yes, judges have the authority and definitely are encouraged in discretion. Sure, you don't want to go too long. You don't want to tire out the jury. But if you're right in the middle of crucial testimony, and it sounds like you're saying that we'd finally gotten the goods. There were some real, more authentic goods here coming out. And then the judge shuts it down. And then overnight, both the defense and the prosecution agree to some kind of testimonial stipulation about anticipated testimony that then requests the judge to dismiss that witness. And I just want to add one more piece here, is that in general, we talked about last time about how the money, someone like Kenneth Feinberg in this case, who's this notorious and cycling money master of a lot of these big cases, including the Epstein money and how it was used in relationship to some of the victims, that those kinds of legal wranglings can be used to shut down standing, so that more information in relationship to discovery, where there's a victim who has standing, i.e. can get past the preliminary aspect of filing a civil suit, and it's not just thrown out immediately because there's a person there who obviously has some kind of legal standing. Once you get past that is when you then have the right to get into things like discovery, where you're able to get documents, where you're able to start putting people, such as in this case, someone like a Leslie Wexner, under oath, and you can videotape them, and you can get the transcripts, and you can get lots of information out that way. And often I've seen it happen even in my own direct case. I've seen the way that inside of this lawyer profession, there is a strong tendency to figure out a way to make deals more quickly in order to basically sort of put the whole thing to bed. Of course, everybody then gets paid quicker. But I even had to insert a piece into my contract with my own lawyers in order to make sure that it was written out that a certain level of discovery had to be reached before I could be forced to consider. And the wording is usually reasonable offers, right? So if you don't do that, and if you get, if the lawyers are sort of running things on their own, and not necessarily if you're committed to something like using the legal process to exfiltrate some deeper truth, whether it's in testimony or documents and that kind of thing from it, then if you don't really push these lawyers to make sure that you get some of this discovery done before they can then force you to start considering reasonable offers, as the wording, they can then, if you don't then take an offer that is considered reasonable. And I will just remind everybody, especially in terms of this case, the way they're using the money to then try to attack these victims of this criminal case, that the only real outcome of any civil suit is almost always it's going to be money. That's the only way that justice works in the civil capacity. You can have maybe something like a statement that someone might be willing to make. You might have some little agreed upon injunctive relief where some bad policy is stopped. But ultimately, the only thing that is coming in relationship to justice is money. And so that money at the end of the civil civil process is then used as leverage to then cut off the civil process, so you don't have access to the powers of discovery in order to either for your own edification, or in this case for the public edification, to gather that information and put it forward. So I just wanted to note that in relationship to what we apparently see as the prosecution and the defense working together, apparently with the judge, to shut down the really important testimonial evidence, it looks like to me.
Well, yes, that's happening. You know, they made her cry because they tried to say that Jane was only interested in the money. And in fact, another motion was filed with the court requesting that her attorney take the stand, come into court, become a witness, take the stand, and basically breach his client privilege. I don't know what it's called, so that they can further try to discredit her for having taken the money. So to use as an example, because I think people don't really understand that when it's a civil lawsuit, so she had to drop her civil lawsuit against Ghislaine Maxwell, which would have resulted in discovery. Most of the documents that the public has seen came from the Virginia Giuffre versus Ghislaine Maxwell defamation case, which began in 2015. And by 2017, Ghislaine Maxwell was like, that's it, I don't want to say anymore. And she settled. But also, the court system that's how it works. In a civil lawsuit, like when O.J. Simpson was taken to civil court by what was the name of the family of Ron Goldman, by the Goldman family, they sued for monetary damage. Now, do you think the Goldman family would have wanted the money, or would they have wanted their son Ron to be alive? The same is applicable here. Would these victims want the money, or would they want the peace of mind of never having been near Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and what that has done to their lives? It's been a major emotional roller coaster that has damaged them for the rest of their life. And it's also, this trauma doesn't stop at the end of, let's say, for example, me. If I had children, it would go on to my children, because I'm traumatized on a certain level. They pick up on it and they're traumatized on a certain level. So this is a multi-generational trauma of rape, and the way these girls, later women and some men and some boys were used and abused, those that remained alive, because I think it was one of the attorneys who represents, at least at this point, about 50 victims. He wrote a book, and his name escapes me, Brad Edwards. He said that when he was looking for victims, there were about 500 just in the area of Florida alone that he could not locate. And one of the victims told me, I think that they're dead. I think they're dead. They were murdered. And that's very likely what she heard from Brad Edwards. So that if you're lucky enough to stay alive, what you're lucky enough to live for is to be traumatized. And so for the court now to possibly allow Jane's attorney to take the stand, to make her look even like she was just a money hungry person, they're grasping at straws. It's, again, like you and I discussed this during our last podcast. This is an old trick to shame the victim, but that's the way the court system works. It's about money ultimately. And if we didn't have the Jeffrey Epstein Victims Compensation Fund run by someone as shady as Feinberg, who basically told the victims, you either take this money or you take the long route, which will not get you anywhere. Well, yeah, it would have gotten them discovery, which we're not even seeing in this trial. We're not seeing a lot of discovery in this trial. So she should frankly take that attorney to court now that she has some money, in my opinion. Take that attorney to court if he goes to court and he breaches your your confidential conversations, and also for the bad advice.
Yes, and you've spoken about government by blackmail. And I just want to make the point here, and this is very much related to the usage of the money, both in terms of cutting off the legal process, but then also as a way of then attempting to discredit the victims of crimes. That there is something that also then has to cover up the government by blackmail, and that's a conspiracy of silence, and it's enforced. And as we pointed out, it's enforced in this Epstein Maxwell household manual. And I'll read it once again. A quote, "Unobtrusive is the key," unquote. Right? That means, like, not only do you not say anything, but you don't look for it, right? You shouldn't even be perceived as being interested. And then next, quote, "Remember that you see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, except to answer a question directed at you. Respect their privacy," unquote. And so an additional way that this conspiracy of silence is enforced also has to do with even the money at the end of a civil suit. I encountered the way that this plays out even in my own personal suit, where there is an intensity. It's just accepted by even one's own lawyers, unless you fight like hell, that there's going to be things like non-disclosure agreements that will just be immediately be accepted. And if your insistence on pursuing a civil suit is not just towards justice, in this case, whatever that ends up being in terms of settlements or agreements, but also truth, like we pointed out before, that it's truth and justice are these key aspects that both need to be pursued in relationship to anything that proclaims to be a justice system, that the truth side of it will ultimately be attempted to be covered up by the conspiracy of silence. And so this is how you get something like Harvey Weinstein, basically, who's has scores and scores and scores of victims, many of them who were on the edge of suing him or were suing him.
Mhm.
And then there are then NDA, non-disclosure agreements that are attached to settlements that are then apparently enforced by such things as Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, former head of Israeli military intelligence, at the core of the Epstein Maxwell operation, but also then recommending to Harvey Weinstein the Mossad corporate cutout black cube to enforce against the journalists and the victims themselves the conspiracy of silence. And so this is the scale of that. I think that it's way even beyond that. And so my last point here, and maybe we'll return to this in the future in terms of the actual Maxwell crime family. And also, I'm not saying it's directly related to your experience in terms of watching things disappear on the internet, key pieces of information. Although I'm not putting it out of it's definitely in the realm of possibility that this is what the sisters, the twins, Isabel and Christine, just go look at their Wikipedia pages. A few years ago, you couldn't even known any of this, but now you can read the background of Christine and Isabel in their professional capacity in terms of software, information systems. Go look at their Wikipedia pages.
I'm sure by the time we're done talking about it, those will be changed too.
But I get the sense that information is now so captured and so frontal that yes, there will be a fight over the pages. But I just want to highlight that people should go look at things like Gilead, and calm touch, and the fact that these sisters were involved in the kinds of software that is not just being used in some kind of corporate offices, but it's taken in by the FBI at the highest levels in terms of their databases. And then when you connect that with the question of Maxwell and the Promise software and the backdoor and the apparent use of that software to keep track of victims after the fact, then you have to begin to understand the level at which the information warfare that's going on surrounding just this case is actually operating.
But to my point, who are they working for? If they're allowed to have, and I don't want to get into this today because this is very deep, but to my point, who are they working for? If our government buys their services, which our government has, who are they working for? They're working for an intelligence operation that is very friendly with our government. So again, CIA, Mossad, and MI5, so that just like Robert Maxwell was allowed to skate away when he breached the security of Sandia Laboratories and the FBI was notified, the Maxwells have been able to do the same. But back to the household manual, because on page 7, before we close for the day, I thought it was interesting that the telephone directories are you on page 7, Jeremy?
Yeah, I am now.
Okay, so telephone directories are to be updated every 6 months, or as new telephone directories are available. So that's interesting that, of course, as they had more, not just victims, but more people, because the people somehow have this narrow belief that the Black Book that we have seen is all inclusive. No, it's not. It is a slice of time at a certain period of those people. But if you want to take Epstein's complete contact list, you would have to get all of these Black Books, which are updated every 6 months for the 20 years that he was operational. You understand what I'm saying? So telephone directories are to be updated every 6 months, or as new directories are available. So then the other thing that I thought was interesting is, and I haven't read the whole thing, but it's very, so unless otherwise instructed, to the beginning of page 8, Jeremy, never disclose Mr. Epstein or Miss Maxwell's activities or whereabouts to anyone. If the caller is insistent, you simply ask to take a message, a time, and a number. Well, bravo, because we do have some notepads that have a lot of that information on it. However, it says, do not be bullied. Interesting, right? Because who's going to call? Very powerful people who know how to bully and or their assistants. And do not show any reaction or impatience, simply be firm. And then it says, advise on the third item on that page, Jeremy, advise Miss Maxwell of any unusual behavior. So not advise Jeffrey Epstein, but advise Miss Maxwell of any unusual behavior, such as strangers lurking around the vicinity of the property. So come on, that to me is like, she really is the lady of the house. And not only is she the lady of the house, usually if I'm living with a man or I'm married, it's going to be his problem. Don't you, right? I mean, you're married. If your wife can't depend on you to keep the premises safe, then she married the wrong guy. But I know she married the right guy, because you're the one who takes care of, if strangers are lurking around your family, you're going to be the one to take action. But in this case, it's Maxwell who's going to take action. I thought that was unusual for a male-female kind of, the way it's usually balanced. What do you have any insight into that?
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like if let's, for example, at the level that I would operate, or our family would operate, if there's a noise, for example, we hear a noise, whether maybe our son, my wife hears it, then I'm told about the noise, and
Exactly.
I go check out the thing that's out of the ordinary in relationship to something like the physical, what's being called in this manual, the security, what they title, quote, the security of the house and of Mr. Epstein, Miss Maxwell, and their guests is your first consideration and should be uppermost in your consciousness, is unquote. And so I agree with you that the fact that Maxwell is the point person for what, in this case, what you would call not only security, but even OPSEC. This is operational security
Hmm.
that she's being alerted to. I think is interesting and of a is out of the ordinary in terms of the normal sort of quote unquote man and woman of the house kind of situation. And I think there's information there that Maxwell is at some level. She's the not only, you know, if this were a lower level operation, she's not the only the pimp of the operation, but at this level, she's the head of operational security of this human intelligence operation, is what
Yeah.
I believe that points directly at. And then my final consideration in this is going back to what you continue to remind me and us about, is that sure, money and threats and all kinds of things that are in the realm of non-physical or psychological manipulation and bullying and threats and all that is key to a lot of this. Meanwhile, the common denominator of organized crime is almost always physical threats, violence,
Hmm.
all the way on up to murder. And you pointed out that the young Muslim woman, I'll remind
Hmm.
people of this, that it was one of the victims here, that
Hmm.
she had, who had a child, that they directly threatened her. I believe Epstein and Maxwell directly threatened her with being fed to the alligators. Remember, down in Florida, and
Yep.
that this was a repetition. This was something that had happened to others. And what's in my mind is this suit that had come up during the run up to the 2016 elections of a girl that was called Maria, who is 12 years old at the time, I believe, when she had made, she was making, now in her 30s, in
No, no,
2016.
no, no. Maria disappeared and she's presumed dead. The other girl, Katie, is the one who filed the lawsuit and then
Thank
retracted
you.
it. Yes.
Thank you for, you're exactly right. Katie Johnson was the pseudonym of the girl who had then filed the lawsuit against Epstein and Trump. And the time, a lot of the allegations and the timeline made a lot of sense to me, and it lined up with a lot of this. And that she had alleged that it was in the Epstein New York
Yes.
brownstone
Yes.
where Trump and Epstein had raped her as a teenager, and then Trump especially, I guess, had threatened her with death. And you're right, Maria was another girl who was in the same, maybe even the same scene at the same time. Now,
Yes.
Wayne Madsen, the reporter, has gone searching for her in town in Connecticut, and believes that she may be alive, but at the very least has helped corroborate a lot of the background of that story. And the reason I bring it up is to just re-emphasize what you point out, that the not only the threat of potential murder in order to silence victims, but very, 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 very likely the actual presence of very likely multiple victims who have been killed in order to silence them needs to be taken into account. And so just talking about this level of silencing around money or the nature of this suit itself is in some way just a de facto cover up of the fact that there's very likely many, many, many more victims who are not even able to speak for themselves because they've been likely killed.
Well, I'm a very good example. I had more than one attempt on my life with a person who was connected to Leslie Wexner, Leon Black, who is above Jeffrey Epstein, who is friendly with the Maxwell family, Robert Maxwell. And, I was kidnapped, held at knife point, I survived. It was a miracle. I was able to escape on the fifth day. But then I was also shot at as I was walking on West End Avenue. The hole of the bullet that grazed my leg is still
Whoa.
embedded in the side of a building. I didn't go back for, a little while because I was just, but it made it impossible for me to continue doing my real estate business in a way that I needed to go out into the world and show property. I had to scale it back. And so, and I, as you can see, I'm very cautious about even having a live video stream of us having a conversation because I'm always being tampered with in one way or another. And we've heard that from some of the victims that the threat hangs over their head, right? That they're not free of the threat. And that's why we haven't heard everyone come forward. And we haven't, only what I think it was 150 people even approached the Epstein compensation fund only after it was said, whether it's true or not, that Jeffrey Epstein had died. Um, so yeah, have victims been killed? 100%. I believe that because I would have been one of those. And if I don't take real good precautions, and someday, I start my days not knowing if I'm going to make it to the end of the day, and that's every day of my life. So, yeah, I would think that the other women who have been entrapped and this is not just a regular. I have to always remind people this is not just a regular bad relationship situation or just this is connected to intelligence because that's who wants you dead. They don't want you to. The people who, let's say Jeffrey Epstein, if he raped someone, would he bother? No, I don't think he would, because frankly, he was busy doing other things, right? Would Ghislaine Maxwell necessarily? Perhaps, because we just found out she's in charge of security for the house, right? So perhaps Ghislaine would be the one to make the phone call, right? Take care of this person, but she would have to get permission because the way it works, if you're working for a covert operation, if you're going to murder someone, you have to get it okayed. You cannot just take it upon yourself. You have to have like either your set of rules, not dissimilar to what Maxwell had for the house, but an unspoken set of rules. Like you're allowed to do this, but if you need to do X, Y, or Z, or maybe the person is a little bit more important, you have to come to us and get permission, and then you can go back and fulfill that, or we'll do it for you. So, I mean, that's kind of a morbid way to end this podcast. So can you say something that's a little more enlightening before we say goodbye for today?
I'm not sure I can, but I do want to say that I think there's something really important about facing these really dark and scary and uncomfortable things that would include the way that you talk about your own direct experience in relationship to acts and threats and how that actually affects an individual, in this case you. And then for us, I feel like there's something that there is an obligation in terms of even just at the level of public interest, even if we were not to talk about our kismet or our human sense of compassion for each other, but let's just make it almost sort of objectivize it and take it into purely in the realm of public interest. It makes a lot of sense for us to talk about these even scarier things in order so that those who are actually at the receiving ends of these kinds of horrific and violent threats and actions don't have to hold it for themselves, and ultimately then the more that people speak about these kinds of things, and the more that people know what to look for, and the more that the things like the courage to speak about it in public becomes infectious. Sure, fear can run rampant, and fear is very often a reasonable response to especially physical threats against ourselves. But
Yeah.
also courage, collective courage, cooperative courage, when we back each other up, when we say, okay, you don't have to hold this by yourself anymore. We are also now know, and we now will hold part of this. It doesn't take away the individual burden or the individual trauma, but maybe it, at the very least, it creates a space where there is a possibility, at least for the individual, then to not have to hold all these things that actually don't belong to them, which is the things about like, why didn't anybody do anything? A lot of
Right.
people knew this was happening. No one did anything. And so once an individual doesn't have to hold those things all to
Mhm.
themselves, then it opens up a space, for actually just dealing with their own trauma. And then the public interest side of it is that nothing is better in terms of the public interest than not transparency. I don't agree with the whole idea of quote unquote transparency. What we want is justice. And in order to have justice, you have to go back to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us God. And that means to actually speak it out into the public, even if we're not under oath in a deposition or on the stand in a trial, but to take on that responsibility, just as our own selves, as whether we're parts of a country or whether we just see ourselves as human beings, to then take on that responsibility and follow it through, and so that that maybe victims in this case, or people like you, Kirby, don't have to hold all of that all on your own. And so I think there is a lot of hope, even in directly addressing the level of morbidness in terms of understanding the nature of violent threat.
I think that that's a very um, accurate statement that you've made, and I've seen it happen. Most of the followers that I have on Twitter, those who aren't spies and are on the other side, are survivors, men and women survivors who have uh, come together to lend support to each other as we lend support to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And in this case, we have four, but when there's victory for one, there's victory for all of us. So, we're all in that space. And really, I want to thank you, Jeremy, because you've never been in this on this side of the fence, but you're a fabulous voice for explaining and helping people understand the layers of this the Maxwell crime family. So before we started our conversation today, I told you how lucky I felt that we stumbled upon each other. And I think that everyone who listens to our conversations, because you say something, it'll make me remember something, and this vice versa. And it's like, I think that people are even something as small as a civil court, that's all you can get is money. We can just get that out of the way. But I think for the way that we discuss this in a way that resonates with people, that people understand it, and then we can dip into the underlayers, even of the even when it's only about the clothing that Larry Visoski has worn. But we do dip in and out of like these kind of fascinating things that I think most people don't, would not necessarily catch. But if when you don't catch it, I catch it. And again, if you'll catch things that I just don't. So thank you for joining us on this. I mean, trying to get Maxwell to at least be put away for 40 or 80 years. I think that would be very nice.
And I thank you so much, Kirby. And people will going from Annie Farmer's boots to Larry Visoski's slippers, and in many ways, it's an antidote to the misuse of fascination by the media to
Yeah.
try to sort of get people distracted by a shiny object. And what I love about your approach to this is that you do really, this is a very careful forensics work that you're doing. It's not obsessing about the the style and all of that. It's basically unpacking the meaning of that, and specifically what it means about our understanding about the important pieces of this case. And so I appreciate that your contribution so much to my understanding.
Thank you. I forgot to ask everyone to please like the video. Uh, please like it, okay? Because as you can see, I almost forgot even now at the end of the video. Uh, Leave your comments. I'm loving the comments that I'm reading, and they're so insightful, and you bring so much to this, because it's not just Jeremy and I, it's Jeremy, I, and you. So we're all in this together. So it's Kirby Sommers
Jeremy ROTHE-KUSHEL'S.
for the Epstein Project podcast. Thank you guys. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.